Gideon Mercer didn't knock. He never did. He pushed open the door of the Holloway farmhouse like he owned it already, because in his mind, he already did. He dropped a single folded paper on the table in front of Marin, didn't even look at her face, and said, "Sign it, or I'll have the sheriff remove you by Friday." Marin looked at that paper. Then she looked at the 80 hogs rooting in the mud outside her window. 80 animals that every person in Caldwell Basin had laughed at her for buying. 80 animals she'd paid her last $25 for because nobody else would. She picked up the paper. Gideon smiled. Then she folded it in half and handed it back. If that were you, your last dollar gone, your land being stolen, and an entire town convinced you were a fool, what would you do? Stay with me. Because what Marin Holloway did next didn't just save her ranch. It changed every family in that valley forever. If you're new here, subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end, because I promise you, you will not see what's coming. Hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The morning Marin Holloway buried her husband, the sky was the color of old bone. Not the dramatic charcoal gray of a proper storm, just that flat, exhausted white that means the sun has given up trying. 12 people showed up to the service. 11 of them left before the preacher finished. The 12th was a boy named Eli, maybe 10 years old, who had no particular reason to be there except that he had nowhere else to go. Marin didn't cry at the graveside. She'd done her crying 3 nights before, alone in the kitchen, with her back against the cold stove and her hands over her mouth so she wouldn't wake anybody. By the time they put Thomas in the ground, she was empty in the way that isn't sad anymore, just hollow, like a jug someone forgot to fill. Thomas Holloway had not been a great man. She knew that. The town knew it too, though most of them were polite enough not to say it out loud on burial day. He'd been a dreamer of the expensive kind, the kind who looked at a piece of land that everyone else called worthless and said, "I see something here." He'd moved them out to the eastern edge of Caldwell Basin 6 years ago, onto 43 acres of cracked clay and stubborn rock that the previous 3 owners had abandoned without ceremony. He saw possibility. The bank saw collateral. When Thomas died, not from hard work or bad luck, but from a fever that a 50-cent bottle of quinine might have prevented had they had 50 cents, he left Marin with the land, a broken fence, $17 in a coffee tin, and debt enough to make a grown man weep. The land broker's office was the 3rd building on the left when you came into town. Gideon Mercer's name was painted on the glass in gold letters, because Gideon Mercer was the kind of man who painted his name in gold wherever he could. He'd been sending letters to Thomas for 2 years. Now he sent one to Marin, and it arrived 4 days after the funeral, which she always thought said something about his character that no amount of gold lettering could improve. The letter was polite in the way that knives are polite, all clean edges and precise purpose. He was prepared to offer her fair compensation for the Holloway parcel, the letter said. Given the land's limitations, he felt $300 was generous. He would hold the offer open for 60 days. Marin put the letter in the stove and watched it burn. She had no plan. She wanted to be honest about that, at least to herself. She had no grand scheme, no secret knowledge, no particular talent that Thomas had lacked. She had 43 acres of bad land, $17, and the specific kind of stubbornness that grows in women when the world keeps assuming they'll give up. She wasn't going to give up. She couldn't tell you why. Sometimes survival isn't a decision so much as a refusal, a hard, wordless no that lives somewhere below thought. It was that refusal that took her to Calloway's stockyard on a Tuesday morning in early October, 3 weeks after Thomas died, wearing her good coat over her worn dress because the good coat was the only thing she had left that still looked like it meant something. Denton Calloway was a large man who smelled of tobacco and horse and didn't bother with small talk. He had 80 hogs in a back pen that he needed gone. Not sold, gone. They'd been consigned from a farm that went under in August, and they'd been in that pen for 6 weeks on half rations because Calloway wasn't running a charity. They were thin in the way that alarmed people, ribs showing, eyes dull. They moved slowly, which hogs normally don't. "They're half dead," said the man standing next to Marin. His name was Ferris Webb, and he farmed 200 acres of decent bottomland and had driven into town specifically to look at the hogs, and had already decided against them before he'd finished chewing his breakfast. "Fool's errand, buying those." $25 for the lot, Calloway said. Not to Ferris Webb. To Marin, because Ferris had already made his opinion visible, and Calloway was a practical man. Marin looked at the hogs. 80 animals. She didn't know much about hogs specifically, but she knew hungry, and she knew stubborn, and she recognized something in the way one of them, a large, red-eared sow in the far corner, lifted her heavy head and looked back at Marin with a steadiness that the others didn't have. 25, Marin said. She had $17 in her coat pocket. She borrowed 8 from Calloway himself, against the promise of repayment in spring. And Calloway, who was practical and also, on some days, decent, said yes. Ferris Webb laughed the whole way to his wagon. He told the story in the feed store that afternoon. By supper time, it had circulated through 2 saloons and the church hall where the women's auxiliary was meeting, and by the following morning, Marin Holloway had become the town's favorite cautionary tale. The widow who spent her last dollar on dying hogs, on that useless land, all alone up there. She heard it, eventually. People are not as subtle as they believe themselves to be. She'd drive into town for flour or salt and feel the conversations adjusting. Not stopping, just tilting slightly, the way talk does when the subject has walked into the room. She'd catch pieces of it. Shame, really. Thomas was foolish enough, and she's worse. Land like that, in a drought year. Those hogs won't last till Christmas. She didn't argue with them. What would she have said? They weren't entirely wrong. She didn't have a plan. She had 23 animals that were already stronger than the others, 43 more that were middling, and 17 that were genuinely worrying her. She had no feed other than what she could forage. She had one fence that kept them roughly contained and another that she was patching with rope and prayer. And she had Eli. She still wasn't sure how Eli had happened. He'd been at the funeral, and then he'd been at her gate 2 days later asking if she needed wood split, and she'd said yes without thinking, and after that he just kept coming back. He was an orphan in the specific frontier sense of the word, both parents gone, bouncing between the households of distant relatives who took him in the way you take in a stray, obligatorily, without warmth. He was small for 10, quick with his hands, and had learned the skill that all invisible children develop, how to make himself useful before someone remembers to send him away. Marin didn't send him away. She didn't have the energy to, and also she liked him, though she didn't say that out loud for a while because saying it made it real, and real things could be taken. "They're not eating enough," Eli said one morning, standing at the fence watching the hogs move slowly through the clay. It was maybe 3 weeks after she'd brought them home, and the strongest ones were holding steady, but the weakest were still worrying her. "I know it." "What are you going to do?" "I'm figuring it." He accepted that without further question, which was one of his best qualities. What she was actually doing was trying to calculate how much acorn mast and wild root she could forage from the thin woods on the property's west edge versus how many animals that could sustain, and the numbers were not adding up. She could keep 60 of them through winter, maybe. Maybe 65 if the winter was mild. But 80? 80 was going to break her. It was thinking about that problem, specifically about the 20-odd animals she couldn't figure how to feed, that made her walk to the eastern edge of the property on a cold Saturday afternoon when the light was going sideways and gold across the rock. She wasn't going anywhere in particular. She was just walking because sometimes the body needs to move when the mind is stuck. She went further east than she normally did, past the place where the clay got worse and the rock broke through in gray slabs, to a spot near the basin's edge, where a line of scrub cedar grew thicker than it had any right to grow. And that was where she found the old woman, or rather, the old woman found her. She was sitting on a flat rock with a tin cup of something steaming, dressed for weather that was colder than today, with hair the color of creek sand and eyes that had been watching Marin walk toward her for longer than felt comfortable. "You the one who bought Calloway's hogs?" the woman said. Not a question. "I am. I'm Nettie Crane. I've got 40 acres on the other side of this line." She nodded east. "I've been watching those animals since you brought them home." Marin didn't know what to do with that, so she said nothing. "You're trying to feed them," Nettie said. "Foraging, rationing. Doing what I can." Nettie looked at her for a moment with those eyes that had probably seen 20 years more than Marin's and had stored all of them somewhere useful. "You're working against the land," she said, "instead of with it." Marin felt a flicker of irritation, the kind you feel when someone sees clearly what you've been too tired to admit. The land doesn't give much to work with. "You think?" Nettie sipped from her tin cup. Those hogs know things about this ground you don't. Hogs always do. Their noses go a foot deep before their feet move. They smell water. They smell root. They smell what's underneath, she paused. You should let them tell you what's down there. Let them loose, you mean? Let them range. All the way across. Stop keeping them in the west pasture where you can watch them. Marin looked back at her land. The western pasture was the only part of the property that looked like anything. The rest was the cracked clay basin and the rock shelf and the scrub and the dry wash where water had run once and hadn't in years. If I let them loose in the basin, I'll never get them back together. Nettie shrugged. Not the shrug of someone who doesn't care, but the shrug of someone who thinks you're asking the wrong question. Maybe, she said. Or maybe you don't need to get them back together. Maybe you need to let them show you something first. She didn't say anything else after that. Not because she was being mysterious. Marin had enough years on her to recognize the difference between dramatic silence and a person who has simply said what they meant and sees no need to elaborate. Marin walked home in the going dark and stood at the fence and looked at the hogs, who were moving with their slow, deliberate energy around the limited space she'd given them. The red-eared sow was watching her again. That night, Marin sat at the kitchen table with her accounts laid out in front of her and her pencil worn down to a nub. The numbers said the same thing they'd been saying for 3 weeks. She couldn't feed 80 animals through winter on this land, not the way she was doing it. She thought about Nettie's words, stop working against the land. She thought about Thomas, who had looked at this same 43 acres and seen something that nobody else could see. She'd loved him for that. She'd also watched it drain them dry, that seeing things that weren't there, and she'd promised herself she wouldn't make the same mistake. But was this the same mistake? Or was this different? She didn't sleep much that night. In the morning, she got up before light, pulled on her coat, and went out to the pen. She opened the gate. The hogs didn't rush. That was the first thing she noticed. She'd expected them to burst through like water from a broken dam, panicked and directionless. Instead, the red-eared sow came forward first, slowly, and stood in the open gate and lifted her head and smelled. Just smelled. Stood there for 10, 15 seconds, reading something in the cold air that Marin couldn't read. Then she turned east, toward the clay basin, and the rest of them followed. Marin watched them go, all 80, moving with a purpose and a quiet that she hadn't seen from them before. They spread as they moved, not scattering randomly but fanning out in a loose pattern, snouts down, reading the ground. She had no idea what she'd just done. Eli showed up at 9, found the pen empty, and looked at Marin with eyes that were doing the math. You let them out. I did. He looked toward the basin. All of them? All of them. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him deciding whether to say the obvious thing, which was that this was either the best or the worst decision she'd ever made, and they wouldn't know which for a while. He decided against saying it, which was wise. Instead, he said, "Should we follow them?" Yes. They followed the hogs east across the clay for most of that morning. The animals worked methodically, not randomly, but with a pattern that was hard to see at first and then, gradually, wasn't. They were following something, a line of scent or moisture, or some underground signal that only they could read. They rooted in places where the clay looked exactly like every other place. They ignored stretches that looked, to Marin's eye, more promising. Around midday, the red-eared sow stopped at a particular spot near the base of the rock shelf, maybe 100 yards from Nettie's fence line, and she didn't just root, she dug. Seriously, with both feet braced and her whole powerful body working, throwing clay up in a spray behind her. 3 other hogs joined her, then 5 more. Marin walked over and looked at the spot they'd chosen. It looked like every other piece of bad ground on this property. Dry, cracked clay, a few inches of it, and then the gray rock beneath. She knelt down and put her hand where the sow had dug. The clay there was darker, just slightly, and cold. Not air cold. Ground cold. The kind of cold that means moisture is close. Marin sat back on her heels and looked at that dark patch of clay for a long time. Then she looked at the 80 hogs working the basin with their quiet, certain purpose, and she thought about what Nettie Crane had said. They smell what's underneath. She was not a woman who cried easily. She'd established that. But something moved through her chest in that moment. Not hope exactly, because hope felt too fragile. Something more like the sensation of a door opening onto a room you didn't know was in the house. She didn't know yet what was down there. She didn't know yet about the spring. She didn't know about Gideon Mercer's plans, or the drought that was coming, or what it was going to cost her to protect what was buried beneath this cracked and dismissed piece of ground. She just knew that her hogs were digging, and that the clay was cold, and that something was under there. She stood up, brushed the clay off her knees, and looked at Eli, who was watching the red-eared sow work with an expression of absolute concentration, like a boy watching something he will remember when he is old. "Go back to the house," she said. "Get the long-handled spade from the barn." He ran. Maren stayed. She put her hand back on the dark clay and felt that cold rising through the ground, slow and steady and undeniable, like something that had been waiting down there a long time, patient as bedrock, for someone willing to listen. She was listening now. Eli came back with the spade at a run, breathing hard, and didn't ask any questions because the look on Maren's face told him this wasn't the moment for questions. He handed it over and stepped back and watched her drive the blade into the dark clay with both hands and all her weight behind it. The first foot came up easy, loose clay, damp in a way the surface wasn't, crumbling at the edges with a smell that was different from the dry dust she'd been breathing for weeks. Organic. Almost alive. She dug another foot. The clay darkened further. The hogs had not moved away. The red-eared sow was standing 3 feet to Maren's left, watching with that same steady patience that had caught Maren's attention at Calloway's stockyard, and several others had gathered in a loose semicircle like they understood something was happening here, like they had known it was going to happen before Maren had. At about 2.5 feet down, water seeped into the hole. Not gushed, not flowed, just seeped, a thin dark line of moisture appearing along the south wall of the hole, and Maren put her fingers against it, and they came away wet. She sat back in the clay and looked at her wet fingers for a long moment. "Is that—" Eli started. "Yes," she said. He crouched down next to her and looked in the hole, and they were both quiet for a while, which was the right response. Some moments earned their silence. The problem was that Maren knew, even with her heart doing what it was doing, even with the wet cold of that seep still on her fingers, that a seep wasn't a spring. A seep was a promise. Maybe a broken one. She'd heard of men who dug for 3 days following a seep and found nothing but more wet clay and the particular heartbreak of a thing that looked like something and wasn't. She covered the hole loosely with the spade to keep the hogs from widening it before she could think clearly, which was a useless gesture because 2 of them were already nosing the edges, but it was the kind of thing you do when you need a moment before you decide your next move. She stood up and looked at the basin. The hogs had spread across maybe 4 acres of it, all working, all nose down and purposeful, and she counted them the way she'd been counting them every morning, a habit she'd picked up in the first anxious week, and got to 81 and then 80 again, and decided she'd miscounted. She had 80. That was what she'd bought. "Go home and get some water and something to eat," she told Eli, "and don't say anything in town about this hole." He looked up sharply. He was 10, not stupid. "You think it's something." "I think it might be something. And I think if it is something, I want to know about it before anyone else does." He nodded, like that made complete sense, which it did, and he went. She spent the afternoon alone with the hogs and the spade and the slow seep of that dark water, and she dug another 18 inches before the light went bad and her shoulders gave out. By then the seep had become something more. Not a flow yet, but a steady weeping of water from the eastern wall of the hole that was filling the bottom 1/2 inch before she bailed it with her cupped hands. Cold water. Shockingly cold for ground that had been baking since June. That coldness meant depth. Water that cold had come from somewhere far down, somewhere the drought's dry reach hadn't gotten to. She didn't know the geology. She wasn't that kind of woman. Thomas had been the one who read the agricultural pamphlets and came home with theories. But she understood intuitively what cold meant in a dry year. It meant this water wasn't surface water. It wasn't runoff that would disappear in another month. It was something older and deeper and separate from the weather entirely. She walked home in the dark with wet boots and clay-heavy hands, and sat down in her kitchen and ate cold cornbread and tried to think clearly about what she was doing. The practical reality was simple enough. She needed to dig this out properly, which meant she needed a post-hole digger and probably help. And the only help available was Eli, who was 10 and hadn't the upper body strength for the deep work. She could hire someone, but hiring someone meant telling someone, and she kept coming back to what she'd told Eli. She wanted to know what this was before anyone else did. The other reality, which she turned over in her mind the way you turn a stone to look at the underside, was Gideon Mercer's letter. $300 for the parcel. Generous, he'd called it, with the specific confidence of a man who sets the terms and expects them to be accepted. She'd burned the letter, but she hadn't burned the information in it, and what the information told her was that Gideon Mercer wanted this land more than $300 worth, or he wouldn't have offered $300. Men like Gideon Mercer didn't overpay. They offered the most they were willing to pay, which was always less than what something was worth to them, which meant this land was worth more than $300 to him. And if it was worth that to him, and she'd just found water on it, cold water, deep water, water that didn't care about the drought. She stopped herself before that line of thinking went too far in one direction. She'd been wrong about things before. Thomas had been wrong about things more spectacularly. The blood of optimistic people ran in her veins, and she knew it, and she didn't fully trust it. She went to bed, didn't sleep much, and was back at the hole before sunrise. It was Nettie Crane who found her there at mid-morning, appearing at the edge of the basin the way she'd appeared before, as if she'd been watching from somewhere and simply decided it was time to walk over. "You found something," Nettie said. Not a question. "Maybe." Marin straightened up. Her lower back had a complaint that she was choosing to ignore. "Water seep? Cold. Maybe nothing." Nettie came to the edge of the hole and looked in. The bottom was maybe 4 inches of standing cold water now, because Marin had been bailing and it kept refilling, which was itself a kind of answer. She stood looking for a while without speaking, which was her way, and Marin waited. "My husband dug wells," Nettie said finally, 20 years of it, before his knees went. Marin looked at her. "This here rock shelf," Nettie gestured at the gray outcrop behind them. "He always said the shelf was a collector. Rain comes down, goes into the ground, the clay sends it sideways, and if there's a break in the shelf, it pools underneath. Could be 20 feet, could be 100. She paused. "Could be nothing, like you said. But the temperature—" She broke off. "What about it?" "My husband would have said that temperature means you're sitting on top of something that doesn't drain. A sealed chamber in the rock." She crouched down, slow, with the careful movements of someone whose joints had opinions about cold mornings, and she put her hand in the water at the bottom of the hole, held it there, pulled it out. "That's cold," she said. And the way she said it, quiet, considered, with the weight of 20 years of a husband's well-digging knowledge behind it, was different from when Marin had said it. It carried more. "I need to dig deeper," Marin said. "Yes, you do." "I can't do it alone, not past 4 feet." Nettie looked at her steadily. "No, you can't." There was a silence in which both of them understood what was being offered and considered. "I don't have money to pay anyone, Tom," Marin said. This was important to say plainly. "I'm not asking for money." "Why would you help me?" Nettie stood back up, using her knees in the way of someone who has learned to complain about them later, privately. She looked at the hogs working the far end of the basin, healthy in a way they hadn't been 2 weeks ago, moving with energy and purpose across ground that everyone in Caldwell Basin had written off. "Because I've been on this land 40 years, she said, "and I've been watching people come and go and write it off, and I'm tired of it. And because those hogs of yours—" She stopped, and something moved across her face that was almost like amusement, though the feeling behind it was more complicated. "Those hogs knew exactly where to go. I watched them from my fence. They didn't wander. They came straight here, and they started digging, and that means something. And I'm old enough that when something means something, I don't walk away from it." That was a long speech for Nettie Crane. Marin understood it was the longest one she was likely to get. "All right," she said. Nettie's contribution was not her own labor. She was clear-eyed about what her 67-year-old body could and couldn't be asked to do, but it was something that turned out to be more valuable in the short term. She had tools. Real tools, well-made ones, a post-hole digger with good steel, and a pump handle that her husband had bought in better years and maintained with the devotion that practical men give to instruments they trust. She also had rope, long rope, the kind of heavy braided line used for pulling fence posts, and she had a hand pump and pipe that had been sitting in her barn since her husband had planned a well he'd never gotten to dig. They worked for 3 days. Eli helped where he could, hauling clay up in a bucket, running for water, fetching tools, performing all the small necessary tasks that are invisible in retrospect but exhausting in the doing. He did it without complaint, which impressed Marin more than any specific skill could have, because she knew enough about 10-year-old boys to know that uncomplaining labor was not their natural state. On the second day, 6 feet down, the seep became a flow. Not a gush. Steady, serious, cold and clear, and absolutely real. It flowed in from the eastern wall of the shaft, with a sound that Marin would later try to describe to people and never quite get right. Not loud. Quieter than you'd expect, but persistent. The kind of sound that told you it had been there a long time and planned to stay. She was standing in the shaft when it happened, hauling clay up to Eli, and the water came in around her boots and kept rising, and she climbed out fast and stood at the edge with Eli and Nettie, and they all three looked down at the water filling steadily from below. Nettie said nothing. Eli said, "Oh." Marin said nothing either. She was thinking about Thomas. She was thinking about 6 years of his certainty about this land and her quiet doubt, and all the time she'd thought he was wrong. She was thinking about how sometimes a person sees a thing that's real, and the tragedy isn't that they were wrong. It's that they ran out of time before they could be right. She was also thinking about Gideon Mercer and the gold letters on his window, and what he would do when he found out what was in the ground below 43 acres he'd been trying to buy for 2 years. "We need to get the pipe in before this collapses," Nettie said. That snapped Marin back. "Right." They spent the rest of that day fitting Nettie's salvaged pipe and working the pump apparatus, which had been designed for a narrower shaft than this one and required adjustments that Nettie diagnosed from memory and Marin executed by hand. The pipe went down in sections, fitted and sealed as best they could manage with what they had. And by evening, the hand pump was sitting at the top of the shaft, crude and slightly crooked. And when Marin worked the handle, water came up. Cold, clear water. Coming up from deep below the basin of a land that the entire town of Caldwell had written off as worthless. Eli pumped the handle and laughed. The kind of laugh that is mostly shock, because sometimes the thing you hoped for actually happens, and the body doesn't know whether to laugh or cry, so it does the one that requires less explanation. Marin didn't laugh. She filled a tin cup with the water and drank it. It tasted like stone and cold and distance. Like something that had been underground a very long time, filtered through layers of rock that had been there before anyone in this valley was born, keeping cold and clean through droughts and hard summers, and all the things that surface water couldn't survive. She drank the whole cup, refilled it, drank that too. "Well," said Nettie, and that was enough. The next 2 weeks moved in the strange doubled time of both very slow and very fast. Slow because each day was full and exhausting, fast because things were changing in ways that couldn't be controlled or slowed down. The hogs were thriving. That was the first obvious change, and it was remarkable enough that even Marin, who'd watched it happen gradually, felt something catch in her chest when she saw them now compared to what she'd brought home from Calloway's stockyard. They were healthy. Not just surviving, thriving, in the specific way of animals given space and purpose and enough to eat, because the basin was feeding them in ways she hadn't anticipated. The roots they were uncovering weren't just feeding themselves. They were turning the clay over, loosening it, and the loosened soil around the spring area was coming back to something. Not rich yet, nothing close to rich, but alive in a way the packed clay hadn't been. She was careful about the spring. She capped the pump when she wasn't using it, and she didn't talk about it in town, and she asked Eli specifically, and Nettie generally not to talk about it either. Nettie needed no asking. Eli needed to understand why, so she told him. "There's a man named Gideon Mercer," she said. "He wants this land. He's been wanting it since before my husband died, and my husband wouldn't sell. And now he thinks I'm going to sell because I'm a woman alone with no money and 80 hogs that everyone thought were going to die." Eli considered this. "But you're not going to sell." "No. And if he finds out about the water, he's going to find out eventually. I can't hide a spring forever, but I want to be in a better position when he does." "What's a better position?" She thought about that. "One where I understand what I have before he gets the chance to tell me what it's worth." That was approximately true, though the fuller truth was that she needed time to figure out what the spring meant legally, which was a thing she knew almost nothing about and had to approach carefully. She'd heard vaguely of water rights, of claims and preemptions, and the labyrinthine ways that frontier law dealt with underground water, and she understood enough to know that ignorance wasn't protection. Ignorance was how people lost things they should have kept. The man to ask was a lawyer, and the only lawyer in Caldwell Basin was Edgar Pratt, who kept an office above the hardware store, and who had, as far as Marin knew, done most of his recent work for Gideon Mercer's land transactions. She thought about that for several days. Then she went. Edgar Pratt was a thin, careful man who wore his suspenders tight and kept his desk very organized, which Marin had always thought was a good sign in a lawyer, because the man who can't keep his papers straight can't keep your interests straight either. He looked up when she came in without particular surprise, the way of a man who sees many people with problems and has learned to distribute his reactions carefully. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "sit down." She sat. She didn't take off her coat because she wasn't planning to stay long. "I have some questions," she said, "about water rights. Underground water specifically. What a person owns if they find an underground spring on their property." Pratt's expression didn't change, which she found reassuring, because if he'd looked surprised or too interested, she'd have stood up and left. He folded his hands on his desk. "In this territory," he said, "groundwater belongs to whoever owns the surface above it, with some exceptions. If you find a spring on your land and cap it properly, which means documented, witnessed, and registered, you have a claim to that water. It's called prior appropriation." "What if someone else claims it after?" "They'd have to prove their claim preceded yours. If yours is registered first." He paused, and in the pause Marin understood that he was doing his own calculation, and she watched him do it. "Are we speaking hypothetically, Mrs. Holloway?" "We're speaking carefully," she said. Another pause. He looked at her in the straightforward way of someone deciding something. "I should tell you," he said, "that I have done work for Mr. Mercer in the past. Land transactions, mostly. I don't represent him currently, but you should know that." She'd expected this. "I know it. And I should also tell you—" He stopped, seemed to weigh something. "I should tell you that he asked me 2 months ago about the Eastern Basin parcels, specifically about water rights in that area. Underground water rights." The air in the room changed slightly. Marin kept her face where it was. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that if there was water down there and someone got to it first with a proper claim, he'd have a very difficult time displacing them." He looked at her steadily. He didn't seem pleased with that answer. "No," she said. "I don't imagine he would." "Mrs. Holloway?" Pratt unfolded his hands and set them flat on the desk. "If you found underground water on that property, you need to register the claim before anyone else files against it. The filing is not complicated, but it needs to be done through the land office in Harwick, which is 40 miles east, and it needs to be witnessed and notarized." He paused. "I could help you with that documentation. I'm not charging you to say that. I'm saying it because it needs to be said quickly." She looked at him for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" He was quiet for a second. "Because Mercer has bought 6 parcels in this basin in the last 4 years, and every one of them came from someone who didn't know what they had until it was too late." He straightened the corner of a paper that was already straight. "I'm tired of helping with that particular kind of transaction." She believed him. She didn't know if she was right to believe him. She was aware that she might be wrong, that Pratt might be more complicated than this moment suggested. But she believed him in the way you sometimes have to believe people because the alternative is paralysis. "All right," she said. "How quickly can you have the papers ready?" "If you come back tomorrow morning, I'll have a draft. You'll need 2 witnesses besides yourself, people you trust." 2 people she trusted. She thought of Nettie, who was 67 and had 40 years on adjacent land and would give a sworn statement with the specificity and conviction of a woman who had no patience for imprecision. She thought of Eli, and then set him aside because he was 10, and she wasn't sure 10 was old enough to witness a legal document, and also she wasn't going to ask a child to sign his name to something that might bring trouble to it. She thought of Ferris Webb, who had laughed at her at Callaway's stockyard, and told the story in the feed store, and who she was going to go see tonight, which would be an uncomfortable conversation, but a necessary one. Ferris Webb was stubborn and practical and had no connection to Gideon Mercer. He farmed his bottomland and wanted to be left alone and disliked pretension in all its forms. He had laughed at her because he thought she was making a mistake, which was different from laughing at her because he wished her harm. And he was a man the land office would take seriously in a way they might not take Nettie Crane seriously, because the world was built that way. She went home, fed the hogs, drew water from the spring, and stood for a moment in the going dark listening to the pump creak and the water come up cold from below. 43 acres, badland, clay and rock and a dry wash and a cracked basin that everyone in Caldwell had written off. She thought about what Nettie had said the first day. Stop working against the land. She thought about those 80 hogs crossing the clay with their heads down, following something she couldn't smell or hear or see, going straight to the one spot in the basin where water was waiting 100 feet below. She thought about the red-eared sow at the gate, standing still, reading the air before she moved. They smell what's underneath. I see it now, Thomas, she said out loud, to nobody. Then she went inside and made supper and planned what she was going to say to Ferris Webb. She drove to his farm that evening after dark, which was not the kind of visit people made without reason. Ferris came to the door with a lantern and a look that was somewhere between suspicious and curious, and when he saw who it was, the suspicion tipped towards something more complicated. Mrs. Holloway, he said, it's late. I know it. I need to ask you something, and I'd rather ask you here than in town. He studied her a moment. He was a big man with the particular weathering of someone who'd worked outside for 30 years, and he didn't make quick decisions. She knew that about him. He made decisions slowly and then stuck to them. Right now he was deciding whether to invite her in or send her away, and she watched him work through it. Come in, he said. His kitchen was tidy in the way of a man living alone who'd been raised right. Not spotless, but functional and organized, and he had a pot of coffee on that he poured without asking, which she appreciated. She sat at his table and wrapped her hands around the cup. I found water, she said. He looked at her. On the eastern parcel. Underground. Cold spring, deep below the clay. Coming up clear. He was quiet for a long moment. You're sure? I've been drinking it for 2 weeks. Another silence. She could see him recalculating, the way a practical man recalculates when data changes. He'd thought she was a fool. Now he was revising, and the revision was clearly uncomfortable because it also meant revising his own read of the situation. And nobody likes being wrong, even decent people. Mercer doesn't know, he said. Not a question. Not yet. But he will. Yes. And you need... He stopped. You're registering the claim. Tomorrow morning, I need 2 witnesses. I'm going to ask Nettie Crane. I'm asking you. He looked at his coffee, turned the cup slightly on the table. She watched him think. You know what he'll do when he finds out, Ferris said. I expect he'll do what men like him do. He's got money and connections and the sheriff's ear on a good day. Ferris's jaw tightened. He could make this very difficult for you. Yes, he could. You're not scared of that? She thought about Thomas in the ground, about $17 in a coffee tin, about 80 starving hogs and $25 and the entire town's laughter following her up the road. I've been scared of it since before I found the water, she said. Being scared doesn't change what's right. Ferris looked at her for a long time. She let him look, because she understood this was his decision to make, not hers, and rushing it would only give him a reason to say no. He set his cup down. What time tomorrow morning? She let out a breath. 8 o'clock, Pratt's office. He nodded. I'll be there. She drove home in the dark and the cold, and the hogs were quiet in the basin, just shadows moving slow and purposeful in the moonlight. And the pump stood where they'd fitted it, slightly crooked, real and permanent as anything she owned. She didn't know, that night, how close Gideon Mercer already was. She didn't know that he had a man, a quiet, watching kind of man, who sat in the feed store and the saloon and listened, and that the man had noticed Marin's trips to the eastern basin and Nettie Crane's visits, and Eli's comings and goings with a bucket, and had put together enough to bring something worth bringing to Gideon Mercer's attention. She didn't know that Mercer had already sent a letter of his own to the land office in Harwick, not filing anything, not yet, but asking questions, making himself known, planting the kind of polite inquiries that powerful men use to reserve space before they move. She didn't know that by the time she sat down with Pratt the next morning, Mercer would be 2 hours behind her, riding toward Harwick with his own papers and his own witnesses, and that the 40-mile road between Caldwell Basin and the land office was about to matter in a way that would determine everything. She slept. She needed to. Whatever was coming, she would need to be rested for it, and she had learned in the months since Thomas died that rest was not weakness. It was the thing that made everything else possible. Outside, the hogs were still working. They never really stopped. She was at Pratt's office at 7:30, 30 minutes before she'd told Ferris to come, because she wanted to see the papers before anyone else did, and she wanted a moment to think without someone watching her face while she did it. Pratt had the documents ready. He'd worked late on them, clearly. There was a candle stub on his desk burned down to almost nothing, and he had the particular careful alertness of a man who hadn't slept enough but wouldn't admit it. He laid the papers out and walked her through them in plain language, which she appreciated because legal documents had a way of burying the thing that mattered inside language designed to obscure it. The claim was straightforward. Underground water source, documented location. He'd used the measurements she gave him, distance from the rock shelf, depth of the shaft. Registered in the name of Marin Holloway, 43 acres, Eastern Caldwell Basin. Prior appropriation, established by discovery and development. Date of first use, the day she'd drawn water from the pump, which she'd told him, and which he'd written down exactly as she said. If this is filed and accepted, Pratt said, the claim has legal standing. Someone could challenge it, but the burden of proof is on the challenger. What would a challenge look like? They'd have to prove their prior claim, meaning they knew about the water and used it before you did. Or they could argue the documentation is fraudulent. He paused. Or they could make your life difficult enough that you don't want to fight it. That last one, she said. Yes, that last one is the most common. Ferris arrived at 8 sharp, which she'd expected from a man like him. Nettie arrived at 10 past, which she'd also expected for different reasons. Nettie moved at the pace she chose and didn't apologize for it. They read the documents separately, without prompting, which told Marin something she already knew about both of them. They were not people who signed things they hadn't read. Ferris asked 2 questions. Nettie asked 1. Then they both signed, and Pratt notarized, and the whole thing was done in 35 minutes. The land office opens at 9, Pratt said. In Harwick. I know. She folded her copy carefully and put it inside her coat. I'm leaving now. Ferris walked out with her. On the step, in the cold morning air, he stopped and said, You know he's going to hear about this. I know. Today, probably. He's got people who watch. I know that too. Ferris was quiet for a moment. He looked down the street in both directions, the way a man does when he's thinking about something he might say or might not. I laughed at you, he said finally. At Calloway's. You did. I was wrong. She looked at him. He was not a man who said that kind of thing easily, and she could see it was costing him something, and she had enough respect for him not to make it easier by saying it was fine. It wasn't fine exactly. He'd been wrong, and he was saying so, and that was what it was. Yes, she said. You were. He almost smiled. Not quite. Well, good luck in Harwick. She drove the 40 miles in 4 hours, pushing the horse harder than she liked to. The road east was bad in the October cold, rutted from early frost and not yet frozen solid enough to be predictable, and twice she had to slow to a walk to get through stretches where the wheels caught. She ate the biscuit she'd brought without stopping, holding the reins with one hand and eating with the other, which was not comfortable but was necessary. The land office in Harwick was a low building with a wood-burning stove going so hard the air inside was almost thick, and the clerk was a middle-aged man named Deuce Farrell, who had the unhurried manner of someone who processed land claims all day and had developed an immunity to urgency. He looked at her documents. He looked at her. He went through the papers with the methodical patience of a man who was going to do this the right way, regardless of how she felt about the pace. He asked her 3 questions. She answered them. He asked to see the notarization. She showed him. He stamped the form and entered it in the ledger and gave her a receipt, and the whole transaction took 45 minutes that felt like 3 hours. Is this date stamped in the ledger? She asked. He looked at her over his papers. Everything's date stamped in the ledger, ma'am. That's the point of the ledger. I mean the time as well as the date. A pause. Yes, the time as well. What time does the ledger show? He looked. 11:47 in the morning. She nodded. Thank you. She was back on the road by noon. She pushed the horse again on the way home, and she was back in Caldwell Basin before dark, and she stopped at Pratt's office on the way through town. Pratt looked up when she came in. He read her face. It's filed, she said. He let out a breath. Good. Did anyone come looking for me today? He was quiet for a half second longer than the question warranted. Mercer came in around 10 this morning. She'd known it was coming and still felt it land. What did he want? He asked if I'd been doing any work for you. I told him that attorney-client communication was confidential. Pratt straightened his already straight papers. He didn't like that answer. What did he say? He said, Pratt stopped, and there was something careful in how he was choosing words. He said you were a confused woman making decisions she didn't understand, and that it would be better for everyone if someone with more experience guided her choices. He looked directly at her. That's a near exact quote. Maren thought about that for a moment. Confused woman. She filed it away in the same place she kept Ferris Webb's laughter at Calloway's and the conversations that tilted when she walked into a room. She kept things there not out of bitterness. Bitterness was a luxury she couldn't afford, but because they were useful. They told her precisely what she was dealing with. He also said, Pratt continued, that he was sending his own papers to Harwick, claiming prior knowledge of the water resource based on geological surveys he'd commissioned last spring. She went still. Can he do that? Prior knowledge without prior use? He can file it, whether it holds... Pratt spread his hands. Prior knowledge is a weaker claim than prior use. You have use. You have development. You have witnesses and a notarized date. His survey might show he knew water was there. Yours shows you found it, dug it out, and used it. He paused. But he has money for lawyers and you don't, and that matters in ways the law doesn't always admit out loud. She drove home in the last of the light, thinking about that. Money for lawyers. It was the place where everything ultimately simplified. Not right or wrong, not documented or undocumented, but who could sustain a fight longer? She had nothing. She had 43 acres of improving clay, and 80 hogs, and a spring she dug out herself with Nettie Crane's dead husband's tools and a borrowed rope. Gideon Mercer had the rest. The drought came hard in November. It didn't announce itself the way bad weather usually does. There was no dramatic shift, no single cold front that people could point to afterward and say, that was when it started. It was more like a slow withdrawal, rain that should have come and didn't, clouds that built and scattered without yielding, the creek south of town dropping inch by inch until it was a string of standing pools that smelled bad by December. Stock ponds went first, then the shallower wells. By January, 3 families on the western side of the basin had hauled water from town, and the town well was dropping at a rate that the older men in the feed store discussed with the focused worry of people who understood what that rate meant if it continued. Maren's spring did not drop. She checked it every morning, first thing, before she did anything else. She'd put a mark on the pipe casing at the water line the day after she'd registered the claim, and every morning she compared the level to that mark. Through October it held. Through November it held. In December, when the creek south of town was practically gone and people were talking about it openly in ways they'd avoided before, the level at her spring was exactly where it had been when she first pumped it up on that October afternoon with Eli laughing beside her. The hogs were magnificent. She would not have used that word to anyone, because it was the kind of word that invited ridicule, and she'd had enough of that, but she thought it privately, alone in the mornings when she watched them move through the basin. The clay they'd worked over had changed. Not into good farmland. She wasn't going to pretend that 43 acres of frontier hardpan had become rich bottomland. But it was different, looser, darker in spots. Things were growing in the turned soil that hadn't grown in the flat-packed clay before, and the hogs were eating those things as well as the roots below, and the whole system had a momentum to it that she hadn't planned and couldn't entirely explain. The red-eared sow had produced a litter in November. 11 piglets, which was more than Maren had expected from an animal that had come to her 3/4 starved. They were lively and aggressive about feeding in the way of healthy young animals, and watching them made Maren feel something she hadn't felt in a while, something that was adjacent to pride but more complicated, because it was mixed with the specific gratitude you feel toward living things that refuse to stay beaten. It was Eli who first heard the talk. He came to her on a Wednesday morning in late January with the look of a boy carrying information he wasn't sure how to deliver, which meant he'd been sitting on it overnight. She was at the pump, checking the level, and she didn't look up when she heard him coming because she knew his step by now. What is it? He came to stand beside her. He was taller than when she'd first seen him at the funeral, almost a year ago now, and 10-year-olds grew whether or not you were paying attention. I heard some men talking in the feed store yesterday. When I was getting the salt you asked for. What men? Cutter Walsh and the Blevins brothers. And someone I didn't know, older, with a gray coat. Gray coat. She had a reasonable idea who that was. There was a man who'd been in town since October, staying at the boarding house, who wore a gray coat and spent time in all the places where information gathered. She'd noticed him. She'd mentioned him to Pratt, who had shrugged carefully. What were they saying? Eli picked at the bark on the fence post beside him. That you've been hoarding the spring water, that you won't share it, and you don't need all of it, and the town's going to run dry while you sit on it. He paused. That it isn't right. That something should be done. She set down the measuring stick she'd been using, looked at him. Did they say what something? Not exactly, but Cutter Walsh said. Eli stopped. He said Mercer had an idea for how to handle it legal-like, and it would be better if everyone got behind him before things got desperate. She understood immediately what this was. It was not a new playbook. She'd heard versions of it all her life, the story of the selfish woman sitting on something that belonged to the community, told by people with a vested interest in the telling. It worked because it took something true, she had water and others didn't, and stripped it of every piece of context that made it mean something different. Stripped out the $25 and the dying hogs and the 3 days of digging and Nettie Crane's husband's pipe and Pratt's late candle and the 40 miles to Harwick in frozen ruts. Stripped all of that out and left only, she has water, you don't, she won't share, and there's a man with an idea. Have I not been sharing it? She asked Eli. Not defensively. She actually wanted to hear how he'd describe it. He blinked. You gave Nettie Crane water last month when her cistern froze, and the Delacroix family the week before that. And me. I take home 2 buckets every time I come. You always tell me to. Yes. So that's not... They're lying. They're telling a story, she said. There's a difference. The facts they're saying are mostly true. I do have water. They don't. What they're leaving out is the why and the how. She looked at the pump. Leaving things out isn't the same as lying. It's worse sometimes because it's harder to argue against. Eli thought about this with the serious focus that was his best quality. What are you going to do? I'm going to think about it. She thought about it for 3 days, which was the right amount of time and also the most she could afford. On the 4th day, Gideon Mercer came to her door. He didn't push it open this time. He knocked, which she found more unsettling than if he hadn't, because it meant he was performing reasonableness. And a man performing reasonableness was more dangerous than a man showing his hand. She opened the door, and he stood on her step with his hat in his hands, and a look on his face that she recognized as the expensive cousin of sincerity. He was a tall man, well dressed for the basin, with the kind of face that photographed well and forgot poorly, the kind of face you remember because it was clearly meant to be remembered. He was maybe 50, with gray at the temples that looked almost deliberate, and he had large hands that he held still with the conscious effort of a man who'd learned to be careful with them. Mrs. Holloway, he said, thank you for seeing me. I haven't invited you in, she said, a slight adjustment in his expression. Of course. I'll be brief. He put his hat back on, which meant he was shifting from the performance of humility to something more comfortable. I'm here because I'm concerned about the situation in the valley. The drought is serious. You know that. People are genuinely frightened. I know it. And you have a resource that could help a great many people. He paused, giving that room to sit. I think there's an arrangement to be made here that would benefit everyone. I'm prepared to compensate you fairly for access rights to the spring, more than fairly. And the distribution infrastructure, the piping, the expansion of the well. I'd fund all of that. The town gets water, you get compensated, and nobody goes without. It was a good offer. She knew it was a good offer because it was mostly not an offer. It was a frame, designed to make her feel that saying no made her the person who let the town go without water. He'd probably practiced it. He was too good at it not to have practiced it. How much? She asked. He smiled. $400 for the water rights plus a percentage of the distribution revenue. $400. More than he'd offered for the land itself. Her mind went sideways to what that number meant. She hadn't had $400 in her life, not all at once, not in her hands. She could feel what it would feel like, and she let herself feel it for exactly as long as it took to think clearly about what he was actually buying. Water rights. Not the land. The water. If she signed over the water rights, she still had 43 acres of improving soil and 80 hogs and a house, but she had no claim to what was under any of it. He could charge whatever he liked. He could cut off whoever he liked. He could decide who got water and who didn't, and in a drought year, that was a power that no one person should have, and certainly not this one. Who controls the distribution? She asked. I'd manage the infrastructure. Who decides the price? A slight pause. The market would. Who decides who gets access? He stopped, and in the stopping she could see the calculation behind the performance, clear as creek water, or as clear as creek water used to be before the drought. He wasn't accustomed to people asking the third question. He was accustomed to people stopping at the first answer. I'd make those decisions initially, he said, with community input. No, she said. He looked at her. The performance of reasonableness cracked slightly at the edges, the way a skin of ice cracks when the weight on it shifts. Mrs. Holloway, I'm not selling the water rights. I'm not assigning management to you. And I'm not going to discuss terms that include either of those things. She kept her voice even. Not cold. She didn't have the energy for cold. Just clear. If you want to discuss something else, I'm willing to listen, but not that. He held her look for a moment. Then he put his hat on properly, which was different from when he'd put it on before. This time, it meant something. The town is desperate, he said, and his voice had changed. Not raised. Men like Mercer didn't raise their voices when they didn't have to. But the warmth was gone, and what was underneath it was harder and flatter and much more honest. Desperate people do things they might not otherwise do, and if they believe, whether or not it's entirely accurate, that you're refusing to help, things could get difficult for you. Is that a threat, Mr. Mercer? It's a description of reality, he said. I'm trying to help you understand your situation. I understand my situation, she said. I understand it better than you'd like me to. He left. She watched him go from the window, and she didn't feel the satisfaction she might have expected from that exchange, because satisfaction requires security, and she had none. She had a filed claim and 2 signatures on a document in Harwick, and a man who'd just told her, in the language of polished threats, that he was going to move the town against her. She went and found Eli, who was in the barn doing the afternoon feeding. I need you to do something for me, she said. He looked up. Go to every family in this basin who's run short on water. Anyone you know of. Tell them they can come to the spring and fill whatever they need. Tell them it's free. Don't say it's from me. Just say there's a spring on the east parcel that's open to anyone who needs it. Eli stared at her. You're opening it up. Yes. But I know what Mercer just did. That's why I'm doing it now, today, before he gets the chance to tell everyone his version of what I'm doing. She looked at the pump through the barn door. You can't fight a story with an argument. You fight it with a different story. He thought about this. What's the different story? The widow with the spring who opened it for free, the week the creek ran dry. He was quiet for a moment. Then he put down the feed bucket. I'll go now. Be back by dark. He went. She went back to the pump and worked the handle until the trough was full, and then she worked it some more, filling every container she had, buckets, barrels, the old watering cans she'd found in the barn, because she didn't know how many people were going to come or when, and she wanted to be ready. The first family arrived that evening, the Delacroix family, who she'd already helped once, and who came now with a wagon and 4 barrels and an embarrassed, grateful manner that she recognized as people who hadn't asked for help before and weren't entirely comfortable doing it now. She pumped water into their barrels and asked after their children and didn't make anything of it because making something of it would have made it harder for them to come back. 3 more families came the next day, and 2 more the day after. By the end of the first week, there was a loose, irregular line of wagons coming to the east parcel every morning, and Marin was at the pump from before light until well into the evening, and Eli was helping her manage the queue and the trough and the barrels, and Nettie Crane came twice a day and helped without being asked, the way she did everything. Marin was exhausted in a bone-deep way that made the weeks after Thomas's death seem merely tiring by comparison. Her hands were cracked from the cold and the pump handle. She was eating whatever was fastest, sleeping fewer hours than she needed, falling into bed with clay on her boots because getting them off required energy she didn't have. But she was not hoarding water. And every person who came to the spring and filled their barrels and drove home They knew she wasn't hoarding it. They'd been there. They'd seen her. That was the story now, and it was real in a way that Mercer's story couldn't be, because his was assembled from absences, and this one was built from things people had experienced with their own hands. She thought Mercer would see this and adjust. She thought he was pragmatic enough to recognize when a play hadn't worked and pivot to something else. She was wrong about that, and she understood later that her error was in thinking his primary motivation was practical. It wasn't. He had wanted this land for 2 years, and he had been outmaneuvered by a woman he'd dismissed, and what drove him now was no longer just about the water. It was about the losing. Men like Gideon Mercer could absorb financial setbacks. They were built for it. What they couldn't absorb, what corroded them at a level below strategy, was being publicly wrong about a person they'd underestimated. She didn't know yet what form his next move would take. She would find out soon enough. It was Nettie who warned her, a Thursday morning in February, standing at the pump with the cold air making clouds of their breath. "He's calling a meeting," Nettie said. "Town hall, tonight." Marin's hands paused on the pump handle. "What kind of meeting?" "The kind where he does the talking." Nettie's voice was dry as split wood. "I heard from Margaret Aldis, whose husband had a drink with Cutter Walsh last night. Mercer's been going door to door telling people the water rights are in dispute, that your claim may not be legal, that there's a proper way to handle water resources that benefits the whole community." She paused. "He's got Deacon Pruitt and the Blevins brothers standing with him, and at least 2 other men I can name who owe him money." Marin pumped. The water came up cold and clear and steady. "He's going to tell them to take the land," she said. "I think he's going to tell them they have every right to." Nettie looked at her. "Which isn't quite the same thing, but it gets to the same place." A crowd. A frightened town in a drought year, with a man who'd framed this as the widow hoarding their only water supply. A crowd that had been thirsty for months and was being told there was a reason for it and a solution and someone to be angry at. "Will you come tonight?" Marin asked. "I planned on it." "Will Ferris come?" "I don't know. He's not someone Mercer would have gotten to directly. He's too independent. But frightened crowds have their own gravity. Even independent men can get pulled in." Marin thought about the meeting. She thought about standing up in a room full of people who were scared and thirsty and had been told a story about her. She was not a public speaker. She was not comfortable with crowds or confrontation or the specific performance that public argument required. Thomas had been better at that than her. Thomas had been good at the room, at reading faces, and adjusting his words to what people needed to hear. She'd always done better one person at a time, but she didn't have the option of one person at a time tonight. Tonight it was all of them. She pumped water until the trough overflowed, which was more than she needed, and which she did anyway, because it was something she could control. And sometimes when everything else is uncertain, you pump water until the trough runs over just to prove that the water is real. Then she went inside and changed into her good coat and tried to eat something and mostly failed. And when the evening came, she hitched the horse and drove toward town with Eli beside her on the seat, because he'd asked to come, and she didn't have the heart to tell him no. And because if she was honest, she didn't want to walk into that room alone. The town hall was lit from inside, yellow light in all the windows. She could hear voices before she got the horse tied. Not angry voices yet. The hum of a crowd still deciding how to feel, which was both better and worse than a crowd that had already decided. She stood outside for a moment. Just a moment. Eli looked at her. "You ready?" She wasn't ready. She hadn't been ready for any of this. Not Thomas dying, not the $25, not the Hogs, not the spring, not Mercer, not any of it. Readiness was a luxury that circumstances hadn't been offering her. "No," she said. "Let's go in anyway." The room was fuller than she'd expected. Every bench was taken, and people were standing along both walls and in the back, and the air had that particular density of too many bodies in a winter-cold space. Wool coats and lantern smoke and the specific tension of a crowd that has been told it has a grievance. She counted maybe 60 people before she stopped counting, which was most of the basin's permanent households. She recognized most of them. She'd pumped water for at least 20 of them in the last 2 weeks. Several of those 20 looked away when she walked in. That was the thing she hadn't fully prepared for. She'd prepared for anger. She could work with anger because anger was at least direct. What she hadn't prepared for was the avoidance, the eyes that found the floor or the ceiling or a neighbor's shoulder the moment she walked through the door. Those people weren't her enemies. They were people who had taken water from her hand and were now sitting in a room being told a story about her and couldn't quite reconcile the two things. And their solution was to not look at her until they'd figured out which version of her to believe. Gideon Mercer was standing at the front of the room near the county surveyor's table, which someone had dragged up to serve as a kind of podium. He was dressed well, better than the occasion required, which was itself a kind of statement. He had 3 men flanking him: Cutter Walsh, who farmed the southwest parcel and had a talent for resentment; Deacon Pruitt, who was not actually a deacon, but had acquired the nickname through a habit of moral pronouncements; and the man in the gray coat, whose name she'd since learned was Hollis Crane, no relation to Nettie, and who was, Pratt had confirmed, a land agent out of the territorial capital who'd been in Mercer's employ for at least 2 years. Mercer saw her come in. His expression didn't change in any obvious way, but something in his posture adjusted. A slight squaring of the shoulders, a recalibration. He hadn't expected her to come, or he had expected her and was recalibrating what her presence meant for what he'd planned to say. Nettie was already there, near the front on the left side, with the particular stillness of a woman who has decided to occupy a space and intends to remain in it. She caught Marin's eye and gave a minimal nod. Nothing more was needed. Marin moved to a spot along the right wall where she could see the whole room and Mercer could see her. She wasn't going to hide in the back. She also wasn't going to push to the front and make this about her arrival. She found her place and stood in it and waited. Eli stood beside her, close enough that his shoulder was almost touching her arm. He was trying to look older than 10 and not quite managing it, but the effort was endearing, and she didn't say anything about it. Mercer let the room settle for a moment. He was good at rooms, she had to grant him that, and then he began. He started with the drought, which was the right place to start because it was real, and everyone in that room had felt it. He talked about the creek, which everyone had watched go dry. He talked about the stock ponds, the shallow wells, the families hauling water from town. He talked about what another 2 months of dry weather would mean, and he talked about it in specific terms, not vague terms, because specific terms made people feel the thing rather than just hear it. He mentioned children. He mentioned livestock. He mentioned what happens to a community that runs out of water before the spring rains come. He was good. She listened carefully and acknowledged to herself that he was very good. Then he turned to the spring. "There is water in this basin," he said, "significant water. Underground water that this drought cannot touch." He paused to let that settle. "We know where it is. We all know where it is." He didn't look at Marin. He didn't need to. The slight movement of eyes around the room did it for him. The question before this community tonight is not whether the water exists. It's who it belongs to. Someone near the front, she thought it was one of the Blevins brothers, said, "It belongs to all of us." Mercer held up a hand, modest, measured. "I understand that feeling, and I think there's truth in it. Underground water resources, particularly in drought conditions, have historically been treated as community resources in frontier territories. There is legal precedent." "There is also a legal claim already filed," said a voice from the front left. Nettie Crane. Not loud. She didn't need to be loud. She had the kind of voice that cut through rooms by virtue of its precision. The room shifted slightly. Mercer looked at Nettie with the expression of a man encountering a planned obstacle. "There is a filing," he said. "Whether it constitutes a valid legal claim is exactly what's in dispute." "It was filed at 11:47 in the morning on the 15th of October, Nettie said. "Witnessed, notarized, registered at the Harwick Land Office. That's not a filing, that's a claim." A murmur. Not all of it sympathetic to either side. Some of it just the sound of people absorbing information they hadn't had before. Mercer shifted. "The legal technicalities are being reviewed by counsel." "Whose counsel?" Nettie asked. "Excuse me?" "You said being reviewed by counsel. I'm asking whose counsel? Yours? Or the territories?" He paused for just a half second too long. "That process is ongoing." "Meaning yours," Nettie said. And then she sat back, which was more devastating than anything else she could have done. The deliberate withdrawal of engagement that said she'd made her point and was content to let the room do the rest. Marin watched the room. This was the moment. Mercer was going to feel the shift and compensate, and the question was how. Whether he'd double down on the legal argument or pivot to the emotional one, the one about children and dried up wells and a lone widow sitting on the community's salvation. He pivoted. Whatever the legal resolution, he said, and his voice had changed. Warmer now, more personal, like a man setting aside the formal business to speak plainly. The practical reality is that this community needs access to that water now, not when the courts have sorted it out. Now. And what I'm proposing is a practical solution, a water authority, managed by a board of community representatives that would fairly distribute the resource and expand the infrastructure to reach every household in the basin. He laid it out clearly. A board of 5, elected by the community, responsible for maintenance and distribution, pricing set by the board, not by any individual. The spring infrastructure expanded with capital he would provide, framed as a loan to the authority, not a purchase, with repayment structured against future revenue. It was elegant. She had to give him that. He'd taken her counter-narrative, the widow who opened the spring for free, and absorbed it into his proposal. The board would distribute free water in emergency conditions, he said. Of course, that would be one of its core mandates. But the board would be elected, and elections could be influenced, and the capital loan would come with terms, and the terms would be in a document drafted by Hollis Crane, and in 5 years Gideon Mercer would own the water authority as surely as if he'd bought it outright, except it would be wearing the face of community governance, and she'd have no legal standing to object. She understood all of this very quickly, standing against the right wall of that crowded, lantern-lit room, and she also understood that the people around her did not understand it, not most of them, because they were exhausted and frightened, and what they heard was a plan, and right now a plan was what they desperately wanted. Someone started to ask a question about the board structure. Someone else asked about pricing. The room was tilting. She could feel it tilt, the way you feel the angle change underfoot on a hillside. She pushed off the wall. She didn't ask permission to speak. There wasn't a mechanism for that in this kind of meeting, and even if there had been, asking permission would have been the wrong move. It would have framed her as a supplicant. She walked to the front of the room and turned around and faced it, and she waited for the room to notice her, which took maybe 4 seconds. Then the room was quiet. She had not prepared a speech. She'd thought about what she might say on the drive in the cold dark with Eli beside her, but she hadn't scripted it, because scripted things sounded scripted, and this room would hear that. She was going to say what was true in the order that it needed to be said. "My name is Marin Holloway," she said. "Most of you know me. Those of you who've been to the spring in the last 2 weeks know me better than most." She let that sit for a second. "I want to talk about what Mr. Mercer just proposed, because I think some of what he said is true and some of it isn't, and you deserve to know which is which." Mercer from the side. "Mrs. Holloway, this isn't—" "I'll be brief," she said, and her tone was not heated. She was careful about that, because heat would let people dismiss her. But it had a firmness that stopped him, and he knew better than to push it again right now because the room was watching. "The water is real," she said. "It's cold and it's deep, and it doesn't care about this drought because it's below where the drought can reach. I found it. I dug it out. I have the legal claim, and I'm not here to argue that. You can look at the Harwick ledger if you want to." 11:47 on the 15th of October. My name, witnessed and notarized. She paused. "I'm also not here to tell you it's mine and you can't have it. I've been giving water to every family that came to me for the last 2 weeks. Free. No conditions. Come with your barrels and your buckets and fill them. That hasn't changed tonight and it won't change tomorrow." A sound in the room. Not quite agreement, too complicated for that. But attention. She had the room's attention, which was what she needed. "What I want you to understand," she said, "is what Mr. Mercer is actually proposing. He wants to create a board." Fine. But the board gets funded by his capital, which means the board owes him. And the people who sit on that board— She looked at Cutter Walsh deliberately, long enough for it to be seen. "You want to ask yourself who will nominate those people and who has the resources to make an election go the way they'd like it to go." Mercer stepped forward. "This is a personal attack." "It's a question," she said. "Answer it if you'd like." He stopped. "Here is what I want to propose instead," she said, and she was aware that her voice was not steady, not breaking, but not steady, and she decided not to hide that because hiding it would take energy she needed for the words. "I will maintain the spring. I will expand it. I've already spoken to Nettie Crane's neighbor about additional pipe, and there are men in this room who know how to dig if they're asked." She looked at Ferris Webb, who was standing in the back. He met her eyes. I will charge every household in this basin exactly what it costs me to maintain the pump and the shaft and the pipe. Not more. Whatever that number is, and it won't be much, it goes back into keeping the water running. If I go a year without it costing me anything, you pay nothing. If I need repairs, you split the cost. She heard someone near the middle of the room say something to the person beside them. She couldn't hear what, but the tone wasn't hostile. The difference between my proposal and Mr. Mercer's, she said, is simple. Under mine, the water costs you what the water costs. Under his, the water costs you what the water costs, plus whatever return on investment he's built into that loan document. She looked at the room. He told me $400 for the water rights when he came to my door. That number didn't come from nowhere. He knows what this water is worth. The question you need to ask is why a man who knows what something is worth is offering to manage it for your benefit. The room was very quiet. Hollis Crane, the man in the gray coat, said from beside Mercer, "The claim itself is still under legal dispute." "Show me the counterfiling," said Edgar Pratt. Everyone turned. Pratt had been standing in the back corner. Marin hadn't seen him come in, didn't know when he'd arrived. And he was looking at Hollis Crane with the specific calm of a man who processes legal documents for a living and knows exactly what that calm does to people who've been overstating their position. Crane said, "The filing is in process." "So there is no counterfiling," Pratt said. "There is an intention to file, which is not the same thing." He looked at the room rather than at Crane. "For those who don't know me, I'm Edgar Pratt. I practiced land law in this territory for 11 years before I came to Caldwell. I prepared Mrs. Holloway's water claim. The claim is valid, it is filed, and it is registered. A future filing by another party would have to demonstrate prior use or prior claim, neither of which exists in the record." He paused. "I thought you should have that information." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from what had come before. This one had weight in it, the weight of a room recalculating. She could see it on faces. The particular look of people who'd been in the process of deciding something and had just been given a piece of information that changed the math. Mercer turned to face the room. He still had composure, she would give him that, but it was a thinner composure than before, like ice that's held all winter but has started to look different in February. "The legal question," he said, "is separate from the practical. Why did you want the land?" It was Ferris Webb, from the back of the room. His voice was not loud, but it carried, the way voices do in rooms that have gone quiet. Mercer looked at him. "I'm sorry?" "You offered her $300 for the parcel a month after her husband died. Then $400 for the water rights when she found the spring." Ferris's jaw was set in the particular way of a man who has made a decision he's not going to reverse. "You told the rest of us the land was worthless. You said it for years. Anyone who talked about buying out on the East Basin, you said it was worthless hardpan, nothing there, clay and rock." He paused. "So why were you offering $300 for it?" The room waited. Mercer said, "I was trying to help a widow in a difficult situation." "You commissioned a geological survey last spring," said a voice. Marin turned. It was Pratt again, still from his corner. "The survey," Pratt said, "was conducted by a firm out of the capital in April. I have the documentation because it was filed in connection with a property assessment. The survey specifically identified subsurface water potential in the Eastern Basin." He looked at the room. "In April. 7 months before Mrs. Holloway found the spring. 7 months during which Mr. Mercer offered to purchase the property while telling the rest of this community it was worthless." The room changed, not all at once, and not completely. Rooms don't change completely all at once, not even when something irrefutable is said, because people need a moment to move through the discomfort of having been wrong about something. But it changed. She felt it changed the way you feel a wind shift, not in any single dramatic gust, but in the new direction of the air. Cutter Walsh, who had been one of Mercer's most reliable voices in the feed store and the saloon, and apparently in this room, was looking at the floor. Deacon Pruitt had his arms crossed, but in a different way than before. Before it had been the crossed arms of a man taking a position. Now it was the crossed arms of a man who had been told something and was trying to decide what to do with it. Mercer turned to face Pratt directly. "Those surveys are proprietary business. They were filed in connection with a property transaction," Pratt said. "They're in the county record." "You had no right to." "I had every right," Pratt said. It's a public record. Anyone in this room can go look at it. Mercer stood very still. She could see him calculating. She'd watched him calculate before, at her doorstep, and it had the same quality. Not the visible thinking of a man working through a problem, but the invisible calculation of a man deciding which of his options cost him the least. He was not a man who gave up. She knew that. He was a man who reoriented. He would find another angle, another approach. And this was not over because men like Mercer did not accept losing in public. But right now, in this room, in this moment, he had nothing. He reached for what he had left. Whatever the legal history, he said, and his voice was perfectly controlled, which was itself a kind of answer to how much he was not feeling controlled. The community's need is real. The drought is real. Whatever individual disputes exist, the question of how this water gets managed going forward. I'll tell you how it gets managed, said a woman's voice from the middle of the room. Everyone turned. It was Clara Delacroix, whose husband had come with the wagon and 4 barrels 3 weeks ago, who had taken water from Marin's pump with the embarrassed gratitude of someone unused to needing help. She was standing up, which in a room like this was its own kind of statement. She pumped that water for us herself, Clara Delacroix said. 2 hours. In the cold. Because our children needed it. She didn't charge us. She didn't make us sign anything. She didn't tell us to come back and see a board. She looked around the room. I was here because I thought, I don't know what I thought. What someone told me, I suppose. Her jaw tightened slightly. I'm sorry for that, Marin. Marin opened her mouth and closed it again, because she couldn't find a response that wasn't either too much or too little, so she just nodded. It was enough. 3 more people spoke after Clara Delacroix, and none of them spoke for Mercer. Mercer tried twice more, once to return to the board proposal, once to raise the counterfiling again as a reason for caution. Both times the room was quieter in response than it had been before. The specific quiet of people who have already made up their minds and are waiting for someone to stop talking so they can get on with it. He finally stopped, and in the stopping there was the quality of a man choosing rather than being forced, the last exercise of a kind of control, the decision of when to leave a room before the room asks you to. He picked up his hat from the surveyor's table. I hope, he said, addressing the room generally, without looking at Marin, that whatever arrangement is made here serves this community well. I'll be watching. He walked out. Hollis Crane and Cutter Walsh followed. Deacon Pruitt stood for a moment, looked at the door, looked at the room, and then sat back down, which was a small act of independence that Marin suspected had cost him something. The room exhaled. Then everyone started talking at once, which was the natural result of a crowd that had been holding its collective breath, and Marin stood at the front of it and let the noise wash over her and tried to figure out how she felt. She didn't feel triumphant. She'd expected to feel something like triumph if things went this way. But what she actually felt was tired. A specific, clean exhaustion, the kind that comes after a thing is done rather than while it's being done. And underneath the tired, something more complicated. The awareness that Mercer wasn't finished. He'd left the room, but he hadn't left the territory. And a man who'd spent 2 years and real money on a plan didn't abandon it because of one bad evening. Ferris Webb pushed through the crowd to where she was standing. He had his hat in his hand and the expression of a man who'd said what he meant, and wasn't entirely comfortable with how much it had mattered. That took something, she said before he could speak. Standing up like that. He looked uncomfortable. It needed saying. Still, he nodded, looked at his hat. My well's going to run dry by March if this keeps up. You meant what you said about the pricing. Cost of maintenance, nothing more. I can dig, he said. If you need help expanding the shaft or laying pipe. I'm not... He stopped. I'm not doing it to pay a debt. I just have the time and the tools. She looked at him. Ferris Webb, who'd laughed at her at Calloway's and told the story in the feed store, and who had tonight stood up in a room full of his neighbors and said the thing that needed to be said because it was true. People were not simple. She'd known that, but she kept being reminded of it. I'd be grateful, she said. He nodded again and moved off, and then other people came. Some to thank her, some to ask about the water arrangements, some just to be near the side that had won, which was a human thing she had long since stopped judging because she understood the pull of it. Eli found her near the door when the crowd had thinned. He looked wrung out in the way of children who've sat through adult conflict for hours, without the outlet of participation, running on attention and the specific electricity of consequence. "You did it," he said. Tonight, she said. He caught the qualification. He was smart enough to catch it. "You think he's not done?" "I know he's not done." Eli was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that she hadn't expected from a 10-year-old, though she'd long since stopped expecting nothing from this particular one. "What does he do next?" Eli asked. She pulled on her coat. "He goes back to the one thing I can't fight in a room full of people, the legal claim." She looked at the door where the cold was coming in from outside. "He'll push the counterfiling. He'll try to tie the claim up in territory court, where he has lawyers and I don't, and where the process takes months and costs money." She paused. "He can't take the water tonight, so he'll try to take it slowly, through paper and process, and the patience of a man who can afford to wait longer than I can." Eli thought about that. "So what do you do?" She buttoned her coat. "I go home. I get up tomorrow. I pump the water. And then I figure out the next thing." She pushed the door open. The cold hit clean and direct. "That's all there ever is, Eli. Just the next thing." They drove home in the dark, and the hogs were shadows in the basin when she unhitched the horse, moving slow and certain across the clay that they had turned and loosened and made into something it hadn't been before. The pump stood where it had always stood since they'd fitted it. Slightly crooked, permanent, real. She put the horse up. She filled the trough. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table in her coat for a while, too tired to take it off. The spring was still there. The water was still coming up cold from far below. Mercer had walked out of a room, but not out of a fight, and she knew it, and she sat with that knowledge the way you sit with any uncomfortable truth. Not comfortably, but squarely, facing it. There was paperwork she didn't understand and lawyers she couldn't pay, and a process that favored men with resources she didn't have. There was a long winter still ahead, and a drought that showed no signs of relenting, and 60-odd families who had just, tonight, placed a kind of trust in her that was its own kind of weight. She was not ready for any of it. She also had a filed claim and 2 good witnesses, and an old woman on the adjacent parcel with her dead husband's tools, and a 10-year-old boy who asked the right questions, and 80 hogs who had walked straight across 43 acres of bad land to find something that everyone else had said wasn't there. She had, against all reasonable expectation, more than she'd had on the morning she'd buried Thomas. She finally took off her coat, hung it on the hook, went to bed. In the basin, the red-eared sow moved through the dark with her 11 piglets around her, rooting in the turned earth, finding what was there. The counterfiling arrived by messenger on a Thursday morning in early March, 6 weeks after the town hall meeting. Pratt brought it himself, which told her it was serious. He could have sent word, but he drove out to the east parcel in the cold and handed her the documents in person, standing at the pump with his coat buttoned to the throat, and his face doing the careful neutral that she'd learned meant he was concerned but didn't want to lead her reaction. She read it slowly. She was not a fast reader of legal documents. Nobody was, who hadn't spent years with them, and she went through it twice before she looked up. "He's claiming prior knowledge establishes prior claim," she said. "Yes." "The survey from April?" "Yes." "His argument is that knowledge of the resource, combined with documented intent to develop it, he's attached correspondence showing he was in negotiation for the parcel before Thomas died, constitutes a form of prior claim that predates your filing." She looked at the documents again. "Does it?" Pratt was quiet for a moment that was slightly too long. "It's a weak argument under current territorial law. Knowledge without use has generally not been held sufficient for prior claim. But," he stopped. But the territory court in Harwick has a judge named Aldous Crane who has ruled in ways that favor development interests in 4 of the last 6 water cases." He looked at her steadily. "Hollis Crane, the man Mercer brought to the town hall, is his nephew." She set the papers down on the fence post and looked at the spring, at the pump that stood slightly crooked in the cold morning light, at the hogs moving in the far end of the basin with their patient, purposeful energy. "How long does the process take?" she asked. "If he pushes it, a hearing could be scheduled within 60 days, possibly sooner if he applies for an expedited review, which, given the drought conditions, a sympathetic judge might grant." Pratt paused. "In the meantime, the filing creates a cloud on the claim. It doesn't invalidate it, but it creates legal uncertainty, and legal uncertainty Makes people nervous about arrangements they've made, she said. Yes. She understood what he was telling her without quite saying it. The families who'd been coming to the spring, who'd been paying the small monthly maintenance fee she'd established, fair and transparent, exactly as she'd promised, would hear about the counterfiling. Mercer would make sure they heard about it, and some of them, frightened of being on the wrong side of a court ruling, might decide to wait and see. And if enough of them waited and see, the maintenance payments slowed, and if the payments slowed, the ability to keep the infrastructure running slowed with it. And if the infrastructure showed signs of not being maintained, Mercer could use that as additional argument in court, that she couldn't properly manage the resource. It was a tightening, a slow one, designed to work over months rather than days, to apply pressure at every point simultaneously until something gave. What do I need to fight it? She asked. Representation at the hearing, someone who knows territorial water law specifically, not just land law generally. He paused. I can prepare the documentation, but I'm not the right person to argue this in front of Aldous Crane. You need someone he can't dismiss, and someone who's argued water rights in front of him before. Name. There's a woman in Harwick named Ruth Solano. She's argued 6 water cases in that court, won 4 of them, and the 2 she lost on facts rather than on law. Pratt adjusted his coat against the cold. She doesn't come cheap. Marin was quiet for a moment. The maintenance payments from 60-odd families amounted to enough to keep the pump in good repair and leave a small surplus against emergency. It was not enough for a lawyer in Harwick who argued territorial water cases. How much? She asked. He told her. She did the math. It took about 4 seconds, and the math was not in her favor. All right, she said. Pratt looked at her carefully. All right, meaning I'll figure it out. She picked up the filing documents and folded them. Can you write to her? Tell her what we have? I already did, he said. Last week, when I heard the filing was coming. He said it without any particular emphasis, just a plain statement of something he'd done, and she looked at him. You heard it was coming before it arrived? I have my own people who listen, he said simply. And then, because he was not a man who elaborated unnecessarily, I also told her you might have a fee problem, and she said to contact her anyway. Marin absorbed this. Edgar Pratt, who had once done work for Gideon Mercer, who had told her in October that he was tired of a particular kind of transaction, had been quietly moving pieces she hadn't known were in play. She didn't know what to do with that gratitude. It was too large for the moment, so she set it aside and held on to it for later. Thank you, she said. He nodded, got back in his wagon, drove away. She stood at the pump for a while after he left, not moving. The cold was the particular dry cold of March in drought country. No moisture in it, no promise of spring yet, just the flat endurance of a winter that had gone on too long and wasn't done. The basin was quiet except for the hogs and the light wind across the clay. She thought about money. She had the surplus from the maintenance payments, which wasn't enough. She had 43 acres of improving land, which she couldn't liquidate without losing the things she was trying to protect. She had 89 now, counting the red-eared sows surviving piglets, hogs that were healthy and growing and would be worth something at market in the spring, but spring market was 2 months out, and a legal hearing might be in 60 days. She thought about what she had that she hadn't counted yet. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table and made a list, not of her debts and deficits for once, but of the other kind of accounting. What she had. What people owed her, not in money. She wasn't going to collect on that in money, but in the older currency of a community that had taken something from her hand when they needed it most. She thought about Ferris Webb, who'd offered to dig and had spent 3 weekends in February helping expand the shaft and lay additional pipe, and who had not asked for anything in return. She thought about Clara Delacroix, whose husband had skills she hadn't tapped. She thought about the 12 families who'd come to the spring in December when their wells ran dry and who had said thank you in various ways and meant it. And she thought about something Nettie Crane had said to her once, in passing, about the Harwick Farmers Cooperative, which was an organization Marin had paid almost no attention to because it had seemed irrelevant to her situation. She drove to Nettie's that afternoon. Nettie listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was her way. She sat in her kitchen with her hands around her tea and her eyes level and let Marin talk through all of it. The counterfiling, Aldous Crane, Ruth Solano, the fee problem, the timeline. When Marin finished, Nettie was quiet for a moment. The cooperative, she said. Yes. You're thinking about the water agreement. I'm thinking that if the families who use the spring have a formal stake in it, not just a pricing arrangement, but a legal stake, a cooperative stake, then Mercer isn't fighting one woman's claim. He's fighting a registered community cooperative with 30-odd member families. Nettie turned her teacup once. That changes the legal character of the claim. Pratt thinks it might. He said he'd have to look at the cooperative charter, but in principle, if the water resource is held by a cooperative rather than an individual, the prior knowledge argument has less purchase. You can't claim prior intent to develop something that's already being developed by a community body. Nettie looked at her with those eyes that had been watching things in this basin for 40 years. You'd be giving up sole ownership. I'd be giving up a claim I might lose anyway to a judge who's somebody's uncle. Marin met her eyes. And I'd be making it real. The thing I said in that room, that the water belongs to the people who need it, at the cost of what it costs to keep it running. Right now, that's a promise. This would make it a structure. Structures can be corrupted, Nettie said. Everything can be corrupted. At least this one would take real effort to corrupt, instead of just waiting for me to run out of money for lawyers. Another silence. Then Nettie said, You'd need 30 families to file a cooperative charter. I have 32 paying maintenance fees right now. You'd need a board. I know. I'll sit on it, Nettie said. Flat, final, not a question. Marin felt something loosen slightly in her chest. I was hoping you'd say that. Ferris Webb would sit on it too if you asked him right. I know how to ask him right. And you'd need the filing fee for the charter, which is not the same as the lawyer's fee, but is also not nothing. I know. Marin put both hands on Nettie's table and looked at them. They were not the hands she'd had a year ago. The winter and the pump handle and the clay had changed them, thickened them, scarred the knuckles in ways that didn't entirely heal. I've been trying to solve this alone, she said. I think that was wrong. Not just impractical, actually wrong. The water isn't mine alone. It never was. The Hogs found it. You gave me the tools. Pratt filed the papers. Ferris dug the shaft. Eli... She stopped. None of this was mine alone. Nettie looked at her for a long moment. No, she said. It wasn't. So I shouldn't be trying to protect it alone either. No, you shouldn't. Marin raised her eyes. Will you help me call a meeting? This meeting was different from the last one. There was no podium, no man with a gold-lettered name staging a performance. Marin held it on a Sunday afternoon at the East Parcel itself, which was deliberate, because she wanted people standing next to the thing they were being asked to have a stake in. She'd set up rough benches from boards and fence rails, and there was coffee because Nettie had brought coffee, and Eli had helped her level the ground around the pump so there was a clear open space where everyone could see. 31 families came. The 32nd sent word they'd sign whatever was decided. She explained the counterfiling plainly, without softening it, because she'd decided that people who were being asked to commit to something deserved to know exactly what they were committing to. She explained Aldous Crane and the fee problem and Ruth Solano. She explained what a cooperative charter meant and what it didn't mean, and what their individual exposure would be if the legal fight went badly. It took 40 minutes. There were questions, some of them hard ones. What happens to the cooperative if she left? What the liability structure looked like? Whether Mercer could challenge the cooperative charter the same way he'd challenged her individual claim. She answered the ones she knew the answers to, and for the ones she didn't, she said she didn't know, and told them what Pratt had said, which was honest and slightly uncomfortable but was the right approach. Ferris Webb asked the hardest question. If this goes to court and we lose, he said, what happens to the water? Mercer gets control of it, she said, or the court establishes his prior claim and he buys it at whatever value the court sets, which would be substantially above what he offered me because the drought has changed the calculation. She looked at him directly. I won't lie to you about that. Ferris looked at the pump, looked at the basin. And if we win? The water stays ours, the cooperatives, at cost, maintained by the members, controlled by a board that we elect. She paused. I want to be clear about something. If we form this cooperative, I don't run it. I'm a member, same as any of you. I'd nominate Nettie Crane for the first board chair, and I think you should vote on the rest. I've been making decisions about this water alone because I had to. I don't want to keep doing that. The room, the open air, the rough benches, the cold afternoon light, went quiet in the way that means something landed. Clara Delacroix raised her hand. I want to vote. That's why we're here, Marin said. The vote was 31-0. The 32nd family's proxy, which was a note signed by Hugh Aldous that said simply, I'm in, do what's right, made it 32. Pratt filed the cooperative charter the following week. It took him 3 days to draft and 1 morning to file, and when he came back from Harwick, he brought Ruth Solano with him. Ruth Solano was not what Marin had pictured. She'd pictured someone older, more formal, with the bearing of someone who spent their days in courtrooms. What she got was a woman maybe 40 years old with ink-stained fingers and a coat that had seen better days and eyes that moved over every document she was handed with a speed and precision that suggested she read the way other people breathe, constantly, automatically, processing without effort. She read the cooperative charter, the original water claim, the counterfiling, and Pratt's analysis in about 90 minutes, sitting at Marin's kitchen table with coffee going cold beside her. Then she looked up. The cooperative changes this materially, she said. His prior knowledge argument was already weak on individual prior claim grounds. Against a community cooperative with a registered charter and 32 member families who are actively using the resource, it's essentially non-existent. She set the papers down. He can still try. Aldous Crane can still rule however he likes because judges do that. But the precedent against prior knowledge without prior use is solid enough that even a sympathetic ruling would be vulnerable to appeal, and Mercer would know that. Marin looked at her. Meaning? Meaning he might not take it to hearing. Solano picked up her coffee, found it cold, and drank it anyway. Men like this make their money by winning efficiently. A prolonged legal fight against a community cooperative that has regional press attention, and I intend to make sure it has regional press attention, costs him more than it gains him. He wanted the water when it was held by one woman with no resources. This is a different proposition. Marin felt the caution that had become habitual kick in against the things she wanted to feel. You're saying he might walk away. I'm saying it becomes rational for him to walk away. Whether he does depends on how much this has become about pride rather than profit. Solano looked at her with a directness that Marin appreciated. In my experience, men who lose publicly to women they underestimated struggle with that calculation. Sometimes pride beats profit. What do we do if it does? We go to court and we win, Solano said simply. And then, because the fee problem had not gone away just because other things had improved, Marin said, I need to talk to you about your cost. Solano waved a hand, not dismissively, practically. Pratt told me your situation. I'm taking the case at a reduced fee with a recovery clause. If the cooperative wins and establishes market value on the water resource, I take a percentage of the first year's revenue. If we lose, you owe me nothing. She looked at Marin over the cold coffee. This is the kind of case I like. Don't read anything sentimental into it. Marin almost smiled. I won't. Gideon Mercer did not walk away immediately. She'd known he wouldn't. Solano had been right about pride, and Mercer had too much investment in his version of events to abandon it without at least one more move. His move was the regional paper. A story ran in the Harwick Territorial Gazette in late March, 4 columns, under a headline about water rights and frontier development, which was sufficiently neutral in its framing to hide the sourcing. The story described the Caldwell Basin water dispute in terms that were technically accurate and contextually dishonest. It mentioned Marin's filing and the cooperative charter, but described Mercer's counterclaim in language that suggested equal legal standing, and it quoted an unnamed area land developer saying that community cooperatives frequently lacked the expertise to manage critical water resources responsibly. Solano saw the story before Marin did. She sent a note that said simply, "Good, he's running out of moves." Marin didn't understand that until a week later when a reporter from the same paper arrived at the East Parcel unannounced on a Tuesday morning and found Marin at the pump, Ferris Webb expanding the pipe connection, 3 families filling barrels, Nettie Crane organizing the maintenance log, and Eli showing a neighbor's child how the pump handle worked. The reporter, a young man with a notebook and the eager, slightly overwhelmed look of someone who'd driven 40 miles expecting something and found something else, stood at the edge of all this and watched it for a while before he said anything. Then he said, "Is this the operation the developer said couldn't be responsibly managed?" Marin looked at the pump, the families, the log in Nettie's hands, the pipe Ferris was setting. "I suppose it is," she said. His story ran the following week. It was longer than Mercer's story and significantly more specific, and it included a photograph of the pump and a sidebar explaining the cooperative structure and the fee arrangement, and it quoted the maintenance records showing exactly what the water had cost each member family per month. A number so modest compared to what water would cost if trucked in from outside the basin that it read as its own argument. The story was picked up by two other regional papers. Ruth Solano wrote to Marin on the 1st of April. The letter said, "Mercer's counsel has contacted me to discuss withdrawal of the counterfiling. I'll need your authorization to enter settlement discussions. My recommendation is to allow withdrawal only with prejudice, meaning he cannot refile. Your call." Marin wrote back the same day. With prejudice. Not negotiable. He agreed. The withdrawal was filed on the 14th of April, with prejudice, and the Caldwell Basin Water Cooperative's claim was confirmed as the sole legal holder of the spring water rights. Pratt called it a clean resolution, which was lawyer language for something that had no loose ends, and Marin sat at her kitchen table with the confirmation documents in her hands, and felt the things she'd been holding in her chest for 6 months slowly, imperfectly release. Not all at once. Not cleanly. The way things release when they've been held a long time, in stages, with residue, leaving you aware of the shape of what you'd been carrying by the sensation of it being gone. She sat there for a while. Then she put the documents in the tin box where she kept the important papers, and she went outside and pumped water. Spring came late that year, as it does in drought country, but it came. The rain started in May. Not dramatic, not flooding, just steady and persistent and real, the kind of rain that soaks in instead of running off, the kind that means something. The creek south of town rose back to half its usual level, then 3/4, then something that looked like itself again, though it would take another good year to be fully right. The spring didn't stop flowing. She hadn't thought it would. It was too deep to be much affected by surface rainfall in either direction. But she checked it every morning anyway, partly out of habit and partly because the checking had become a kind of ritual she wasn't ready to give up. Something about putting her hand on the pipe in the first light and feeling the cold, steady reality of it was necessary in a way she didn't examine too closely. The hogs went to market in May. Not all of them. She kept 22, including the red-eared sow and the best of the piglets, and she kept the 3 boars that had come through the winter strongest. The rest went at prices that reflected the improved condition of animals that had been ranging free across 43 acres of turned earth and feeding on roots and range, and the prices were better than she'd expected, considerably better. The buyer from the regional market looked at them and said he'd take as many as she could bring him next year at the same terms, which was the kind of sentence she needed to hear twice before it settled. She paid Pratt a proper fee, which he tried to decline and she insisted on. She set aside the cooperative's repair fund. She paid 3 months ahead on the maintenance costs and put the rest in the coffee tin that had held Thomas's $17, which was a deliberate choice that she was aware of making. She also bought Eli a decent coat, because the one he had was thin, and she'd been looking at it all winter with a combination of guilt and helplessness, and now she could do something about it. He protested. She ignored the protest. "You've been working on this place since October," she said. "That's a coat." He put it on and looked at himself in the way of boys who aren't accustomed to things fitting properly, and she could see him trying to decide how to feel about it. "I'm not Charity," he said. Not belligerent, careful, making a distinction that mattered to him. "No," she said. "You're not. You're the person who ran to get the spade the morning I found the spring, and who carried water all winter, and who went to every family in the basin and told them they could come fill their barrels." She looked at him directly. "You're not Charity, you're owed." He looked at the coat sleeves for a moment. "Okay," he said, which was the most she was going to get, and was enough. The question of Eli's permanent situation had been sitting in the back of her mind since winter, and she'd been careful with it the way you're careful with something you want enough to be afraid of wanting wrong. He was still officially in the care of a distant aunt, who lived 12 miles east and came for him occasionally with the resigned air of someone fulfilling an obligation they'd have preferred not to have. The aunt was not cruel. Marin had observed her enough to be clear on that, but she was indifferent in the specific way of someone who has too much to manage, and this particular thing wasn't attached to her heart. Marin had spoken to Pratt about it in March, quietly, asking what the process looked like. Pratt had explained patiently and without assumption what guardianship required in the territory. She'd thought about it for another 2 months. On a Wednesday afternoon in late June, she asked Eli to sit down at the kitchen table, which was unusual enough that he immediately looked alarmed, and she said, without preamble because she'd decided preamble would make it worse, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer what you actually think, not what you think I want to hear." He sat straight. "Okay. Do you want to stay here? Not visiting? Not working? Actually, stay." He was very still for a moment. Then, "You mean live here?" "Yes." The stillness held for another moment, and she let it hold because she'd meant it about answering what he actually thought. "You're not doing it because you feel sorry for me," he said. It was half statement, half question. "No, I'm doing it because you carried water all winter and you asked the right questions and you got my spade when I needed it, and this place is better for having you in it." She paused. "And maybe a little because I don't want to be alone here. That part's for me, not you." He considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything. She watched him think through it, the visible processing of a child who'd learned to think carefully before trusting, because trusting had consequences. "Would I have to go to school?" he asked. She almost laughed, which was not the right response, so she kept it to a small smile. "Yes." "Okay," he said. Then, "Yes, I want to stay." She nodded. Didn't make too much of it. That was important, to not make it bigger than it was in the moment, because big moments can collapse under the weight of their own significance if you press on them too hard. "I'll talk to Pratt this week," she said. "Okay," he said again. And then, because he was 10 and because some things needed to be said in small voices, "Thank you, Maren." She looked at the table. "Don't make me say something sentimental," she said. "I have a reputation." He laughed. It was a real laugh, the full kind, and it filled the kitchen the way that kind of laugh does. And she let it, and when it faded there was a warmth in the room that didn't come from the stove. Gideon Mercer left Caldwell Basin in July. No announcement, no farewell. He'd kept an office in the building with his name painted in gold on the glass, and one morning the glass was empty and the office was locked, and by noon it was common knowledge that he'd taken the stage east the previous evening with 2 trunks and Hollis Crane and hadn't said where he was going. The boarding house had been paid up. Nothing owed, nothing dramatic, just gone. People said various things about it. Some said he had interests elsewhere that needed attention. Some said the Gazette stories had made the basin too visible for the kind of work he did. Some said he'd lost money on the deal and cut his losses, because men like Mercer ran on profit calculations, and this one had stopped calculating in his favor. Maren heard all of this secondhand, because she was not in town much that month. She had a cooperative to manage, and hogs to tend, and pipe to extend, and Eli's school enrollment to arrange and paperwork. She didn't understand that Pratt walked her through in weekly sessions that she'd come to value not just for the information, but for the hour of sitting across from someone who treated her competence as a given. When she did hear about Mercer leaving, she was at the pump, Nettie told her. She was quiet for a moment after Nettie said it. "Good," she said. "That's all?" Nettie asked. Maren thought about it. She thought about what she'd expected to feel: satisfaction, vindication, the clean resolution of something that had pressed on her for months. She thought about Thomas in the ground and $17 in a tin and 80 starving hogs and the dark cold clay at the bottom of a hole she'd dug herself. "He saw something real," she said. "He just wanted to take it from people instead of working with them." She paused. "That's a waste of a good eye." Nettie looked at her for a moment. "That's a generous reading." "It's not generous, it's just accurate." She worked the pump handle. The water came up cold and clear and steady, same as always. "I'm not interested in being angry at him anymore. He cost me 6 months of anxiety and a lot of sleep and some money I didn't have. He also pushed me into forming the cooperative, which is more durable than anything I'd have built on my own." She looked at the water filling the trough. "I can hate him for the first part, or I can be grateful for the second. I'd rather be grateful. It's less exhausting." Nettie was quiet for a moment. Then, in the tone of someone paying a compliment they've been considering for a while, "Thomas was a fool about land, but he wasn't a fool about you." Maren looked at her. "He told me once, this was before he got sick, that the smartest thing he'd ever done was convince you to come out here with him." Nettie's voice was matter-of-fact, not soft. "I thought he was just talking at the time. Men do." She picked up the maintenance log from the fence post. "He wasn't. Marin turned back to the pump and worked the handle for a while without speaking, because some things land in a place that words can't reach quickly, and trying to force words into that place ruins it. The water came up and filled the trough and ran over, the way it always did when she wasn't paying attention to where the top was. By the following spring, the Caldwell Basin Water Cooperative had 41 member families, a proper iron pump to replace the crooked one, 130 yards of laid pipe reaching to the 3 nearest homesteads, a repair fund with enough in it to handle 2 winters of normal maintenance, and a 5-person elected board that met on the first Sunday of every month in the East Parcel Barn, which Marin had cleaned out and fitted with decent benches for the purpose. Nettie Crane was board chair. She ran meetings with the economy of someone who had no patience for meetings that didn't end in decisions, which was an attitude the board found bracing, and which led to resolutions getting made rather than deferred. Ferris Webb handled the infrastructure committee with the thorough, slightly obsessive attention to physical systems that had made him a good farmer, which turned out to transfer well to pipe maintenance. Clara Delacroix ran the records, because she was meticulous in ways that turned out to matter enormously when you were tracking water usage across 41 families. Marin was on the board. She was not the chair. She'd meant what she said at the second meeting. This wasn't hers alone to run. She showed up every first Sunday, paid attention, voted when votes were called, and offered opinions when she had them and held them when she didn't. Some months she said very little. Some months she said what needed to be said in a way that shifted the room. She was learning the difference, and it was slow, and she didn't always get it right. The hogs multiplied. By the second autumn, she had 112, ranging the basin and the adjacent acreage that Nettie had formally incorporated into the grazing agreement, a paper arrangement that suited both of them and that Nettie's lawyership of 40 years of solitary living had not made her sentimental about. The red-eared sow was the oldest of the original 80 and showed it in the deliberateness of her movement and the authority she had among the others, which was a kind of authority that didn't come from size or aggression, but from something harder to name. She moved through the basin, and the others adjusted around her, not following but orienting, the way things orient to what they trust. Marin watched her sometimes from the fence in the early morning, before Eli was up, before the work of the day had started. She watched the way the old sow moved across the turned earth. Slower now, heavier, with the particular gravity of something that had endured. And she thought about Calloway's stockyard and the pen of dying animals, and $25 she'd borrowed 8 of, and the specific moment when the sow had stood in the open gate and lifted her head and read the air before she moved. She had known where to go. She had walked straight across 43 acres of bad land and found the one place where cold water was waiting below the clay, and she had dug, and the others had followed. Marin had done the same thing, in her way. Not straight. She hadn't gone straight at anything. She'd gone crooked and scared and wrong-footed and exhausted. She'd made decisions that could have failed and some that nearly did. She'd trusted people she wasn't sure of and been wrong about some and right about others. She'd stood in a room of people who believed a story about her and said true things in a voice that wasn't steady and hoped it was enough. She was not a legend. She was a woman who hadn't quit, which is a smaller and more honest thing, and which she'd come to think was actually more valuable, because not quitting is available to most people, while being a legend mostly isn't. Eli turned 11 in September. She made him a cake with the good flour and put a single candle on it, because she only had one, and he looked at the cake with the expression of someone receiving something they'd given up expecting. He was enrolled in the Caldwell School and was, by the teacher's report, a serious student with a particular gift for arithmetic and a tendency to argue with premises he found unsound, which the teacher mentioned as both a challenge and a quality she respected. He did chores every morning before school without being asked, which had taken about 2 months to establish as a pattern, and which Marin did not comment on, because commenting on it would make it a transaction instead of a habit. He still came to the pump with her sometimes in the early morning, the way he had since October of the previous year. They didn't always talk much. Sometimes they stood and watched the hogs and the light change and didn't say anything, and that was fine. That was its own kind of conversation. On the morning of the first hard frost of his second autumn, the air sharp enough to make their breath visible, the basin iron gray before the sunrise reached it. He stood at the fence with his hands in his coat pockets, the good coat she'd bought him, that he'd grown 2 inches toward since spring, and he said, "Do you think the spring will keep going? I mean, forever?" She thought about this seriously, because he'd asked it seriously. Not forever, she said. Nothing's forever. Springs fail, aquifers drain, things dry up. She paused. But deep springs and sealed rock formations, they can last generations, longer than us, maybe longer than our grandchildren's grandchildren. He thought about this. That's a long time. It is. So what we did, he stopped, looking for the right word. It'll still be here after we're not. Probably, she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, I think that's the best kind of thing to do, the kind that keeps going after. She looked at him. This boy who had shown up at a funeral with nowhere to be and had been useful before she'd thought to ask, and who would carry some of this forward in ways she couldn't predict and wasn't trying to control. Yes, she said. I think that's right. The sun came over the eastern ridge and hit the basin, and the frost on the clay caught it and threw it back, and the hogs moved through that light with their heads down and their patient, certain purpose, and the pump stood where it had always stood, straighter now, properly fitted, but still in the same spot where the red-eared sow had dug on an October morning before anyone knew what was down there. The water came up cold. It always did.